Hi guys, we're almost in recession. So today we're going to talk about tips and tricks on how to make your home, your house look a little more vintage. My vast experience goes back to renting a room in Edinburgh and trying to work with what I had, but I've actually used a lot of the very same tricks when I was decorating my own flat years later. If you've seen my flat videos, you probably know that a lot of work and money went into this flat. So of course today we're not focusing on things like furniture or renovation because these things are expensive. Instead, I'm going to share things that I've noticed have helped me a lot in giving this flat the vibe, the vintage vibe that I've wanted and that I've always dreamt of. So I would say that only 10% of the stuff that I own, not counting furniture, is actual vintage and antique pieces that were bought in like proper antique shops and vintage shops. And the remaining 90% of what I have in my flat can be categorized as one of the following: thrifted, DIY, modern but looks vintage, and gifted. So let's take a look at some of those. Before we get into that though, this video is sponsored by Son de Flor. Son de Flor is a sustainable slow fashion brand that makes high quality linen clothing. And Son de Flor fabrics are Eco-Tex certified, ensuring that they're safe for the environment, so double win. They currently have a summer sale discount of up to 40% off, and up to the end of June, you can also get an additional 5% off with code CarolinaJune5. So go get that and enjoy your beautiful clothes. If you want a vintage style house and your budget is a little tight, thrifting is your best friend. Thrifting is the best friend that you call at midnight and you tell your best friend a dream. By morning, that dream is already fulfilled. You don't even have to thrift exclusively vintage items. A lot of knickknacks, a lot of stuff that is in thrift shops, they just look old even if they're not. And if they don't look old, but they have potential to look old, you can always Rachel Maxi it and make it look old. When it comes to thrifting, my absolute best advice is know what you're looking for. And I don't mean entering a thrift shop with a particular piece in mind, but for example, if you want a lamp that looks vintage, you have to learn what vintage lamps look like first. The more you look at old things, the more you familiarize yourself with vintage designs, the more you'll be able to recognize this style when it comes to it. Pinterest is your best friend, but also you can look for stuff on Etsy and eBay, even if you don't buy anything, just to familiarize yourself with what the general feel is. So then you go to a thrift shop, you see a piece and you're like, this low-key looks like the 1929 lamp design that I saw on eBay for like hundreds of dollars. It doesn't have to be the same. The chances are it's only going to be like inspired, but sometimes designs don't exist in a vacuum, so sometimes they might be inspired by what you're actually looking for. If you can't have something and you really want it, you can always make it. Now, I will admit I did not have many DIY projects in this flat simply because just the renovation was so much work that it kind of burnt me out. But one of the things I did in this flat and in my student flat as well was I used my printer a lot. I printed out a lot of stuff. I mean, yeah, it would be amazing to own original vintage prints, but a lot of vintage art, like for example, Art Deco posters that I really wanted, are collectible right now and they're reaching incredibly high prices on auction sites, so I knew that's not an option for me. So I just printed a lot of art myself. You can also just go to a printer shop and just ask them to do it for you and you'll probably save a little bit more money because printer ink is so expensive and it actually does not last long. Like a single poster would use up like half of my ink. So maybe it's a better idea to let someone else do it for you. But if you have a printer, that's also an option to just print out stuff you want. You can even print out black and white stuff if you don't want to waste your ink. So I just printed a lot of the art in the flat myself, like this wall in the kitchen or these posters in the bathroom or this one here. I didn't know what to put up on the wall, so I just printed one more. So I'm a printing advocate because I think it's a really, really simple way to make your flat look good. Speaking of the frames on my kitchen wall, did you know all of the frames are actually IKEA? Of course, in the ideal world, I would just buy everything used and I wouldn't have to buy new things. But in some cases, like for example, this one, I wanted all of the frames to look the same. So sourcing vintage frames that are the same style and also in my price range was kind of impossible. So I just got these from IKEA. Sometimes it's just faster and cheaper to buy something modern, and I don't think it's a shame to do it if that's where your budget lies. That's completely fine. And some modern things look pretty vintage and are, as I said, cheap. So these vases I got from TK Maxx or TJ Maxx if you're in the US. You can also look for vintage style modern things such as radios or even switches and plugs, since they add to the vintage field, but they can actually be quite cheap if they're just plastic. Also, this is an important one. Remember to tell everyone you know that you are decorating your house in vintage style, because then there is a high chance that some of your friends will just gift you items that will be perfect for your house. And because vintage style is so eclectic, there is a high chance that whatever they come up with is actually gonna be the right style. So sometimes gifts are like hit or miss when it comes to decorating your own space, but with vintage style, there's like a really good chance that it's gonna be something cool. But this is all focusing on the ways of obtaining vintage style items rather than saying what those vintage style items should be. So you need your walls completely covered in stuff. You need to cover the entire space where you live with pictures. Okay, maybe not all of the walls and not entire walls, but pictures and art, especially when framed, just transform the place instantly. Even when I was a student and I wasn't allowed to put nails into my walls, I would just print out Pre-Raphaelite art and I would just glue it to my wall with this like weird white tacky thing. You can also thrift or buy postcards, cards, vintage photographs. All those will also look nice on the walls or even just placed on the furniture. Very cute vintage vibe. People in the past surrounded themselves with a lot of textiles, and minimalism was not really trending back then, so most of the textiles from the past did have some sort of a pattern. That's why patterned fabrics like curtains, cushions, blankets, especially when it's all mixed together and it's different patterns with different colors, they give off that very vintage vibe. Sometimes it can lean towards the grandma style, so if that's not something that you're going for, you should be careful with mixing patterns, but most of the time, especially when it's completely different patterns. For example, you have a floral pattern, stripes, and then polka dots. That gives off that very vintage vibe that I think is also pretty easy to achieve if you just thrift fabrics. Because I will say that modern designers are not too keen on vintage style patterns. Yeah, thrifting is your best bet. Sometimes you can find really nice modern designs, but then they're expensive. Speaking of cushions, did I even mention cushions? I don't know why, but cushions, again, give off vintage and are also helpful in making your space feel very cozy. So I try to place cushions on almost every sitting surface that I have and on the bed. You can again thrift some cushions, but make sure to wash those first. Or you can buy modern ones that just look vintage, and that's actually quite easy and quite cheap as well. Now, I don't know why, but this really works and it's also super simple. Books. Place books around your house in random places, like on the window, on the table, on a chair that you're not using. They don't even have to be books that you're actually actively reading or even books that you're interested in. Books just look nice and very homely. They work great as decoration. You can even place them underneath other items so you get those like layers. Like I placed them underneath my lamps and I think that looks kind of cute. And again, you can get books cheaply in thrift shops, so that's another win. Or simply online. Wherever you're shopping, there are cheap options for you somewhere out there. Because I tend to kill my plants and I just gave up on having plants in my flat, I do have a lot of dried flower bouquets that were actually given to me at some point in time, and I just decided to dry them and use them as decoration. And this is something that I feel like, again, feels very vintage and very feminine in a way. If you have pets that are enjoying munching on those, you might have to reconsider though. I think these are all the tips that I could come up with. If you're decorating your house in a vintage style, do let us know your favorite tips and what works for you, and yeah, I hope your houses are vintage and cute. What the hell was that? I'm sorry. Bye.